The first time I saw the flashing lights, I wasn't worried. It was just another Tuesday in the grand suburban experiment known as Meadowlark Creek Estates, where the biggest emergency was usually a rogue sprinkler head dampening the precious petunias of Brenda Fromke, president for life of our homeowners association. But this time, the lights weren't strobing over a waterlogged flower bed. They were painting my own driveway in strobes of red and blue, illuminating Brenda herself, who was standing on my lawn like a furious garden gnome, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at my front door. Inside, completely oblivious, was my son, Alex. She was screaming, a high, panicked squeal that cut through the evening air. "He's in there! He won't answer! He's a threat to this entire community!" Deputy Old Tom, a man whose face was a permanent roadmap of weary resignation, was trying to placate her. His partner, a young buck named Evans with mirrored sunglasses and an air of profound confusion, was just trying to figure out what law had been broken. The answer, of course, was none. The crime was lèse-majesté. The crime was ignoring the Queen. Yep, that's me, peeking through the blinds, wondering how a simple birthday visit from my kid had escalated into a full-blown siege. You see, what Brenda didn't know, what no one in Meadowlark Creek knew, was that my quiet, hoodie-wearing son didn't just work for the government. He was the guy the government sends when other guys in the government get into trouble. Let's rewind. 3 weeks earlier, it all started, as these things so often do, with a clipboard. Brenda Fromke had moved into the neighborhood a year prior, a refugee from some corporate human resources department, where her talents for nitpicking and soul-crushing bureaucracy had been honed to a razor's edge. She was a woman who saw a world of beautiful, chaotic life and instinctively reached for a 3-ring binder to organize it into submission. Upon her arrival, she found our sleepy, disorganized HOA to be an affront to God and man. Within 6 months, through a campaign of sheer, relentless nagging, she was president. Her first act was to purchase a clipboard, which became a permanent extension of her right arm. It was her scepter and her shield, the source of her power. From it, she dispensed judgment in the form of violation notices, written in a cramped, aggressive cursive. Our first sin was the basketball hoop. It had been at the end of our driveway for 15 years. According to Brenda's reading of a bylaw written in 1987, it was an unapproved permanent structure. We got a notice. My wife, Helen, wanted to just take it down. I, however, am a retired land surveyor. I've read more covenants, deeds, and easements than Brenda has had hot dinners. I have a deeply ingrained, almost spiritual opposition to ceding ground to clipboard tyrants. Helen, I said, holding the notice like it was a dead rat. This isn't about the hoop. It's about the principle. I wrote a polite, formal letter back, citing the grandfather clause in Article 9, Section 4 of the Covenants. I also subtly attached a copy of the original plat map, which showed the hoop's location had been approved by the developer. It was a tactical nuclear strike in the language of suburban warfare. It was overkill. And it was a declaration of war. Brenda fell silent for 2 weeks. The silence was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. She was regrouping. She was studying her sacred texts, searching for a new angle of attack. I had poked the bear, and now the bear was going through my trash, metaphorically speaking, looking for violations. She found one in our mailbox. The little red flag, she claimed, was a shade of red not approved by the Architectural Review Committee, a committee of 3 that she chaired and comprised the entirety of. The approved color was barn red. Ours was, apparently, cherry red. The fine was $50. Tell me where you're listening from, because I need to know if this level of madness is universal. This was the rhythm of our lives for a month. A violation notice for grass height being a 1/4 inch too tall. A warning about the unseemly accumulation of leaves on our roof. A formal complaint that the wind chimes my daughter gave us for Christmas were producing a discordant and disruptive series of tones. Brenda was a maestro of misery, conducting a symphony of petty grievances. Each time, I'd fire back a meticulously researched legal letter, pointing out ambiguities in the bylaws, or citing state statutes that superseded HOA rules. I was playing chess. She was throwing rocks. But she had an endless supply of rocks. My neighbor, a gentleman named Mr. Hemlock, who had lived on this land since it was just a field, watched the whole affair with amusement. "She's a classic overstepper," he told me one afternoon over the fence. "Gets a little taste of power and thinks she's been crowned empress. Happens every 5 years or so. They always burn out." I wasn't so sure. Brenda had the fire of a true believer. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was on a holy crusade to save us from the scourge of individuality. She was building a beige utopia, one $50 fine at a time. Then, my son came home. Alex was 23, but with his lean build and tendency to wear worn-out university hoodies, he could pass for a teenager. He's a good kid, but quiet. Intensely quiet. He works for the federal government, a job he describes with such deliberately boring language that no one ever asks a follow-up question. "I'm in interdepartmental oversight and accountability," he'd say, and you could watch people's eyes glaze over. It was a conversational black hole. He drove a generic black sedan, a Ford Taurus, the kind of car you see a million of and notice none. He parked it in our driveway, came inside, gave his mother a hug, and settled into the guest room to work remotely for a few days before my birthday weekend. To Brenda, this was not a son visiting his parents. This was an anomaly, a variable she could not control. His car was an unregistered vehicle. His presence was an unauthorized long-term guest. His quietness was, in her mind, pure suspicion. The day after he arrived, the first note appeared, tucked under my windshield wiper. "All guest vehicles present for more than 24 hours must be registered with the HOA office. Please see Bylaw 11.7. There was no HOA office, of course. There was just Brenda's dining room table. I threw it away. The next day, another note, this one more aggressive. "Second notice. Failure to register will result in the vehicle being towed at the owner's expense." This one I kept. It went into a growing file I'd labeled, simply, Brenda. The climax of this initial skirmish happened on Thursday. Alex was in the middle of his workday, holed up in our spare room which served as his temporary office. I was in the garden, and Helen was at the grocery store. Alex had told us that he had a series of extremely sensitive no-interruption calls that day. He'd closed the door, put on his headphones, and entered his zone of bureaucratic seriousness, which is, of course, precisely when Brenda decided to strike. She marched up our walkway, clipboard in hand, a look of grim determination on her face. She rang the doorbell. No answer. She waited exactly 10 seconds and rang it again, longer this time. Still nothing. I could see her from the side of the house, her foot starting to tap. This was not how things were supposed to go. People were supposed to answer. They were supposed to bow to the authority of the clipboard. She then escalated to knocking. A firm, 3-rap knock. Rap, rap, rap. Silence. Another, harder knock. Bam. 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 From inside, not a peep. Alex, deep in whatever federal rabbit hole he was in, was completely oblivious. To Brenda, this silence was not a sign of a busy man on a work call. It was a confession. It was the defiant act of a criminal, a squatter, a neighborhood threat, who was mocking her authority from behind the safety of a locked door. Her face, which was already pinched with perpetual disapproval, tightened into a mask of pure fury. She wasn't just a woman being ignored. She was the law, and the law was being flouted. She took a step back from the door, pulled out her phone, and I watched, with a growing sense of dread and dark amusement, as she dialed 911. The complaint, as I would later learn from Deputy Old Tom, was for a suspicious individual barricaded in a resident's home, refusing to make contact. It was the beginning of the end. She had taken a war of paper cuts and just launched a cannonball. A cannonball aimed squarely at my son, who had the power to fire one back that was 1,000 times bigger. She just had no idea what kind of arsenal she was provoking. If you've ever had to deal with a neighbor who thinks their personal opinion is legally binding, you know the feeling. Tap that like button if you've ever battled a clipboard tyrant. The arrival of the local constabulary was, for Brenda, a moment of triumph. She stood on my lawn, arms crossed, radiating an aura of vindicated righteousness. She had summoned the power of the state to deal with the insolent occupant of my guest room. Deputy Old Tom, whose family had bought lumber from my grandfather, lumber he probably used to build his own damn house, looked at me with an expression that was 1 part apology and 2 parts exhaustion. "Brenda," he sighed, the name coming out like a puff of smoke. "What is it this time?" She launched into her tirade. The unregistered car, the mysterious young man, the refusal to answer the door. "He's hiding something, Tom. Decent people answer the door," she declared, as if it were a commandment handed down from on high. Young Evans, the rookie, was dutifully taking notes, trying to frame this as a legitimate police matter. "So, ma'am, you're saying an unknown individual is in this house, and the homeowners are—" "Where?" he asked, looking at me. I stepped forward. "I'm the homeowner. He's my son. He's working," I said, my voice flat. Brenda scoffed. "That's what he says, but he won't show his face. He's probably in there doing drugs or running some kind of internet scam." The sheer, unadulterated confidence of her paranoia was almost impressive. She had constructed an entire criminal enterprise in her head based on a closed door. It was a fantasy world built of suspicion and bylaws, and she was its undisputed queen. At that moment, the front door opened. Alex stood there, blinking in the sunlight. He had his headphones around his neck and a look of mild annoyance on his face, the look of a man interrupted in the middle of a complex task. He was wearing a faded Stanford hoodie and sweatpants. He looked less like a hardened criminal and more like he'd just woken up from a nap. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the scene. The 2 cops, Brenda practically vibrating with rage, and me looking like I was about to have an aneurysm. "Sir," Deputy Evans started, stepping forward with official purpose, "we've had a report of a suspicious individual at this address. Could I see some identification?" Alex just sighed. It wasn't a dramatic, angry sigh. It was the sigh of a man who deals with inconvenient fools for a living, and had just found one on his doorstep during his time off. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed Evans his driver's license. Evans looked at it. He looked at Alex. He looked back at the license. "Alex Vance. Address is here. Date of birth checks out," he said, turning to Tom. "He's the homeowner's son." Tom gave Brenda a look that could curdle milk. "Brenda," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "this is the 3rd time this month you've called us for a non-emergency. You can't use the sheriff's department to enforce your little HOA rules. This is a waste of taxpayer money and our time. Don't call us again unless you see an actual crime being committed." Brenda's face went through a remarkable series of transformations. First, shock that the police weren't immediately arresting Alex. Then, indignation that she was being reprimanded. Finally, it settled on a mask of cold, hard fury. She had been publicly humiliated. The forces of law and order had sided with the heathens. She snatched her clipboard from the porch railing where she'd set it down, gave Alex a look of pure venom, and stalked back to her own house without another word. The retreat was more menacing than any confrontation. It was a promise of future vengeance. Tom handed me a card. "If she harasses you again, call me directly," he said, quietly. "There's a line between being a concerned neighbor and outright harassment. She's tap dancing all over it." I thanked him. He and Evans got back in their car, and the circus left the cul-de-sac. Alex just shook his head and went back inside. "Sorry about that," I said, following him in. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he shrugged. "It's fine. I deal with people like her all the time. Small pond, big power trip." He paused at the door to the guest room. "Just for the record, though, that call," she interrupted, "I was on with the general counsel for the Federal Housing Finance Agency." He gave me a small, wry smile. The irony is thicker than her rule book. He closed the door, and I was left standing in the hallway with a sudden, beautiful, and deeply petty idea forming in my mind. The bear hadn't just been poked. It had been humiliated, and now it was going to go back to its cave and plot something truly awful. Fine. I had been plotting too. My war had been defensive, a series of parries and dodges. Now, it was time to go on the offensive. My first move was to retrieve the file labeled Brenda. It was time to add some new documents. I started with a formal request, sent via certified mail to the HOA's official post office box, which I knew was just Brenda's mailbox, for the complete financial records for the past 2 years. As was my right under state law, I also requested the minutes of every board meeting. This was no longer about basketball hoops or mailbox colors. This was about discovery. This was about finding the rot. Brenda thought she was fighting a battle over neighborhood aesthetics. She had no idea she was stumbling into a war over legal and financial liability, a war she was spectacularly unequipped to fight. My next stop was Mr. Hemlock's house. He was sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like a remarkably detailed bird. He'd seen the whole cop car drama, of course. He just nodded as I approached. "Looks like the Empress escalated her tactics," he said, not looking up from his work. "She did," I replied. "And I think it's time to escalate mine." I told him my plan. I told him about my formal request for the financials. He finally looked up, a slow grin spreading across his face. "About time," he said. "You know, I was on the board, back in the beginning, before it got like this. We were just trying to make sure the front entrance got mowed." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The developer, a slick fella named Garrison, set up the initial covenants. He put his sister-in-law in charge of the books. She stayed on for years, even after he was long gone. Handed everything over to Brenda last year." He pointed the half-carved bird at me. "If you're looking for rot, start with the landscaping contract. Always been the same company. Always been way too expensive. It was better than a tip. It was a treasure map." "Garrison Landscaping and Maintenance," Hemlock grunted. "Run by a fella named Pete Garrison, the developer's cousin." The pieces clicked into place with a satisfying snap. This wasn't just pettiness. This was potentially years of systemic graft. A family affair designed to milk the homeowners dry under the guise of maintaining the common areas. Brenda hadn't created the system, she had inherited it. But her tyrannical nature made her the perfect person to protect it. No one dared question the budget when they were too busy worrying if their garbage cans were visible from the street. The tyranny was a feature, not a bug. It was a smokescreen for the real grift. My little suburban squabble had just stumbled into something much bigger. My wife, Helen, saw the look on my face when I came home. "Oh no," she said. I found a discrepancy on a 19th century survey map face." "What did you do?" "I've gone on the offensive," I said, pulling out my laptop. It was time to do some digging on Garrison Landscaping and Maintenance. It was time to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. Brenda thought she was fighting a war for control of the neighborhood. She was about to find out she was just a pawn in a much older, much more expensive game. And my son, the quiet guy in the hoodie, was a grandmaster at ending games like this. The next 2 weeks were a study in escalating absurdity. Brenda, stung by her public defeat, doubled down. She couldn't use the police, so she weaponized the only thing she had left, the bylaws. She became a phantom of the cul-de-sac, a fleeting shadow seen at dawn and dusk, clipboard in hand, measuring, photographing, documenting. It was as if she had declared a state of emergency, and our property was ground zero. We received a notice that the small decorative flag by our front door, a flag with a picture of a bumblebee on it that our granddaughter had picked out, was an unapproved banner under Article 5. The fine was $25. We received a notice that the oil stain on our driveway, a spot no bigger than a silver dollar, constituted a chemical contamination of common property, even though it was 20 feet inside our property line. The fine was $100. The pièce de résistance came in the form of a certified letter. It informed us that a comprehensive review of our property records had revealed that the massive, 100-year-old oak tree in our front yard was, in fact, an unapproved arboreal installation. According to Brenda, the original plans for the subdivision didn't show a tree of that size, and therefore, it was out of compliance. She demanded its removal within 30 days. or we would face a daily fine of $50. She wanted us to cut down a century-old tree. A tree that was on this land before her house, my house, or this entire God-forsaken subdivision even existed. It was a move of such breathtaking arrogance that I couldn't even be angry. I was in awe. It was like watching a toddler try to issue a parking ticket to the sun. This was no longer just petty tyranny. This was a descent into madness. Helen, who had once counseled moderation, was now fully on board with my crusade. "The tree?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "She's coming after my tree?" That oak tree was where we'd hung a tire swing for our kids. It was where Alex had climbed, fallen, and broken his arm in second grade. It was a part of our family's history. Brenda had finally crossed a line that wasn't written in any bylaw. She had made it personal. Meanwhile, my own quiet war was proceeding apace. The HOA, meaning Brenda, responded to my request for financial records by sending me a heavily redacted summary sheet. It was useless. The line item for grounds maintenance was just a single enormous number next to the name Garrison Landscaping. It was a deliberate stonewall, and it was exactly what I had expected. It was also illegal. State law mandated transparency. So I drafted a second letter, this one written by my cousin, a lawyer in the city who owed me for talking him out of buying a timeshare in the 90s. It was 5 pages of dense, threatening legalese, citing specific statutes and the personal liability of board members who willfully conceal financial information from homeowners. We sent it not just to Brenda, but to the other 2 board members, a retired accountant named Stan and a woman named Carol, who seemed to be pathologically conflict avoidant. I wanted to see if her loyal soldiers would hold the line when faced with the threat of being sued personally. While that legal grenade was ticking, I focused on Garrison Landscaping. A few hours of online digging revealed they were a very small operation. In fact, their corporate registration listed only one officer, Pete Garrison. Their address was a P.O. box in a town 50 miles away. There were no company vehicles, no website, no advertising. They were a ghost. A ghost that was cashing checks for nearly $200,000 a year from our small community of 60 homes. The math didn't add up. Our annual dues were $3,000 a household. That meant the landscaping contract consumed almost the entire HOA budget. Paving, snow removal, insurance. Where was that money coming from? I went back to the plat maps, the original documents filed with the county when the subdivision was created. I spent a weekend in my office, surrounded by diagrams, deeds, and covenants, cross-referencing everything. And that's when I found it. It was a tiny notation on an old survey, a detail so small and arcane that no one but a fellow surveyor would have even noticed it. It was an easement. A public utility and maintenance easement that ran in a 10-foot strip along the back of every property that bordered the undeveloped woods behind our neighborhood. The easement granted the county not the HOA the right and the responsibility to access and maintain that area. For the past 20 years, Garrison Landscaping had been billing the HOA to clear brush and cut grass on land that was legally the county's job to maintain. They were charging us a fortune to do a job that our taxes were already supposed to be paying for. It was a slow, steady, 20-year bleed, a quiet, brilliant, and utterly fraudulent grift. Brenda, in her obsessive quest to punish me, had no idea she was the gatekeeper for a multi-million-dollar scam. She was the useful idiot, the clipboard-wielding dragon guarding a treasure she didn't even know existed. The final piece of the puzzle came from Alex. He came out of the guest room one evening, looking tired but satisfied. "Hey, Dad," he said, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "Quick question. Does your HOA have its own liability insurance, or is it covered under a master policy that's federally backed, like through the FHA or Fannie Mae?" The question was so specific, so out of left field, that it took me a second to process. "I think it's a federally backed master policy," I said, remembering a line from the closing documents when we bought the house. "Why?" Alex took a long drink of water. "No reason. Just curious." He gave me that same wry smile. Let's just say, my office takes a very dim view of organizations that misuse funds while being insured by the U.S. taxpayer. A very dim view indeed. He tapped the side of his nose and went back into his room. The message was clear. Brenda's little kingdom wasn't just a private fiefdom. It was connected, however tenuously, to the federal government. And my son had just found the wire. The stage was set. Brenda had scheduled an emergency all-hands HOA meeting. The agenda, which she'd posted on every lamppost, was titled, Addressing the Clear and Present Danger to Neighborhood Security and Property Values. It was a meeting about me, about my son, about my tree. She was coming for a public hanging. What she didn't know was that I was bringing my own rope. If you're enjoying this story of suburban justice, hit that follow button, because you won't want to miss the fireworks at this HOA meeting. It was a showdown, and I had a briefcase full of receipts. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It was a small, sterile room that usually hosted children's birthday parties and sad holiday potlucks. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. Brenda had set up a projector and a screen. She stood at the front, next to a folding table, her clipboard placed squarely in the center, like a sacred text. She was wearing a sensible beige pantsuit, the official uniform of bureaucratic authoritarians everywhere. The air was thick with tension and the smell of cheap coffee. I took a seat in the back with Helen. Alex was with us, dressed not in his usual hoodie, but in a simple, well-fitting dark gray suit with a plain blue tie. He looked anonymous but serious, like a junior associate at a law firm. He carried a slim leather briefcase. No one paid him any mind. He was just the suspicious individual from the other week. Brenda banged a small Gavella new and deeply ominous accessory. This emergency meeting of the Meadowlark Creek Estates Homeowners Association will now come to order, she announced, her voice ringing with self-importance. She launched into her presentation. It was a masterpiece of paranoia and innuendo. The first slide was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Alex's black sedan. Unidentified vehicle, the title read. She spoke of unknown elements, infiltrating the community and the lax security standards that allowed it. She moved on to a slide about my defiance. It was a list of all the violation notices I had refused to pay. A pattern of willful noncompliance, she called it. She painted me as a rogue agent, a chaos merchant, determined to undermine the very fabric of their peaceful, beige existence. The residents, mostly older retirees who had bought into Brenda's vision of a tightly controlled paradise, were nodding along. They murmured in agreement. Stan and Carol, the other two board members, sat beside her, looking like hostages. Finally, she got to the main event. A slide with a picture of my beautiful oak tree, a red X crudely drawn over it in what looked like Microsoft Paint. This structure, she said, her voice dripping with disdain, is the most flagrant violation of all. It is unapproved, undocumented, and a clear violation of the aesthetic harmony we have all worked so hard to build. She proposed an immediate emergency vote. First, to levy a special assessment against me for the cost of the tree's removal. Second, to grant the board new powers to require background checks for any guest staying more than 72 hours. It was her magnum opus, the culmination of her crusade. She was going to win. The room was on her side. She was going to make me pay to cut down my own tree and then submit my own son to a background check. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. When she finished, she looked out at the crowd, triumphant. "Are there any questions before we vote?" she asked. A rhetorical question. She didn't expect any. That was my cue. I stood up. "I have a question," I said, my voice calm and carrying through the quiet room. All eyes turned to me. Brenda's face tightened. "It's a financial question." I walked to the front of the room, holding a folder. "I'm curious about the landscaping contract. It seems to consume nearly 100% of our annual dues. Could the board explain why Garrison Landscaping is paid nearly $200,000 a year to mow a few acres of grass?" The mood in the room shifted instantly. It was a splash of cold, hard reality in Brenda's fantasy world of aesthetic harmony. People weren't just nodding anymore. They were listening, Whispers broke out. Stan, the accountant on the board, started sweating. That's confidential financial information, Brenda stammered, caught off guard. It's not confidential, I countered, my voice hardening. It's our money, and I have here, I said, holding up the legal letter from my cousin, a formal notice that the board is in violation of state law by concealing these records. I then pulled out the plat map. And I'm also curious why we are paying Mr. Garrison, who, by a strange coincidence, is the cousin of the original developer to maintain this entire 10-foot wide strip of land behind our homes, when this county plat map from 1988 clearly designates it as a public utility easement to be maintained by the county. It would appear we've been paying a private contractor hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years to do a job the county should have been doing for free. The room erupted. The spell was broken. It was no longer about my tree or my son. It was about their money. Decades of their money. Stan looked like he was going to be sick. Carol was staring at her hands. Brenda was sputtering, her face turning a blotchy red. This is slander. It's a personal attack. He's trying to distract you from his own violations. She shrieked, but her voice was shrill, desperate. The authority was gone. Then Alex stood up. He walked calmly to the front of the room and stood beside me. He opened his briefcase and took out a single folder. Good evening, he said. His voice was quiet, but it commanded attention in a way Brenda's never could. My name is Alex Vance. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Brenda is right about one thing. This is about a violation, a federal one. He turned to Brenda. Ma'am, as president of this board, you are the fiduciary for this organization. An organization whose assets, I've confirmed, are insured under a policy regulated by the Federal Housing Administration. He let that sink in. He was connecting her little clubhouse to the federal government. My name is Alex Vance, he repeated, his voice dropping a little lower, a little colder. I am the Deputy Inspector General for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. My office investigates, among other things, fraud, waste, and abuse in federally insured housing entities. And this, he said, tapping my folder full of evidence, looks a whole lot like fraud, waste, and abuse. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sound I will cherish for the rest of my days. The blood drained from Brenda's face. She looked at my quiet, hoodie-wearing son, now standing before her in a suit, and saw not a slacker, but the full, terrifying weight of the United States government. She had called the cops on him for not answering the door while he was on a conference call discussing the very regulations she was now accused of violating. The poetic justice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. This meeting is adjourned, she squeaked, banging her gavel weakly. Oh no, Alex said, his voice as soft as silk and as hard as steel. I don't think it is. I think this is just getting started. We have a lot to talk about, starting with 20 years of bank statements. The Empress of Meadowlark Creek had been dethroned. Not by a popular uprising, but by a quiet man with a government ID she had mistaken for a trespasser. The look on her face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The aftermath was a glorious, cascading collapse. It was like watching a badly built Jenga tower finally give way. The moment Alex identified himself, the entire power structure of Meadowlark Creek evaporated. Stan, the accountant, immediately offered his full cooperation, practically tripping over himself to hand over the secret, unredacted financial records he'd kept on a flash drive hidden in his desk. Carol, the conflict-avoidant one, resigned from the board via a tearful email sent at 3 a.m. Brenda Fromke simply disintegrated. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. The divine certainty that had animated her for the past year was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified silence. She locked herself in her house and refused to speak to anyone. It turned out her entire persona was a fragile shell, and Alex had shattered it with a single sentence. His office, the HUD office of the Inspector General, formally opened an investigation. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and utterly terrifying for those involved. Two very polite, very serious people in sensible shoes spent a week interviewing residents and poring over 2 decades of financial documents in the community clubhouse. They were like archaeologists unearthing a lost city of graft. The story they uncovered was even worse than I had suspected. Pete Garrison, the developer's cousin, hadn't just been overcharging for the easement. He'd been billing the HOA for phantom services, sprinkler repairs that never happened, snow removal on sunny days, tree trimming for trees that didn't exist. It was a work of fiction, a novel written in invoices. And for 20 years, the board, starting with the developer's sister-in-law and ending with Brenda, had either been complicit or willfully ignorant, signing the checks without a single question. Brenda's role, it seemed, was that of the perfect dupe. She was so obsessed with her petty power plays, the color of mailboxes, the height of grass, that she never bothered to look at the multi-million-dollar hole being blown in the budget she was supposed to be guarding. Her tyranny wasn't a smokescreen for her own grift. It was a smokescreen that allowed the old grift to continue, uninterrupted. She was so busy being the queen of the anthill that she never noticed the elephant standing in the middle of it. The most satisfying part of the whole affair was the public reversal. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Alex became a local folk hero. They didn't call him the Deputy Inspector General. They called him the Fed, or the Quiet Man, or, my personal favorite from Mr. Hemlock, the kid who brought the Queen to heel. My battle against the violation notices was recast from the ramblings of a stubborn old man into a righteous crusade against corruption. I was no longer a troublemaker. I was a whistleblower. People who had avoided my gaze for months were now stopping me in the street to shake my hand, telling me they always knew something was fishy. Sure you did. The climax of this reversal came during a second emergency meeting, called by the residents themselves. Brenda wasn't there. Her house already had a for sale sign on the lawn that, I noted with immense satisfaction, was now slightly overgrown. The purpose of the meeting was to dissolve the old board and elect a new one. Nominations were opened. Someone nominated Stan, who politely declined, stating he planned to spend his retirement as far away from financial documents as humanly possible. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, "I nominate Mr. Hemlock." A wave of applause went through the room. Hemlock, who was sitting in his usual spot in the back, just grunted. He stood up slowly. "Fine," he said. "I'll do it. But I'm making 2 promises. 1, our only bylaw is going to be, don't be a jerk. And 2, we are taking every copy of the old rule book, and we are having a bonfire." The cheer that went up was deafening. It was the sound of a small beige dictatorship joyfully collapsing in on itself. A week later, he was true to his word. We all gathered in the common area, and one by one, people tossed their copies of Brenda's sacred texts onto a roaring blaze. It was a baptism by fire, a cleansing of the neighborhood's soul. Alex couldn't be there, of course. He'd already gone back to D.C., his work quietly finished. He called me that night, though. "Heard about the bonfire," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Don't burn the whole place down." "No promises," I said. "By the way, whatever happened with that Garrison guy?" There was a pause. "Let's just say he's now having a very detailed conversation with the IRS," Alex said. "Turns out when you get paid millions of dollars and don't declare it as income, they get curious. Poetic justice. It's a beautiful thing. My life in Meadowlark Creek Estates is different now. It's quieter, freer. People plant whatever color flowers they want. Kids leave their bicycles on the lawn. The basketball hoop is back up. Mr. Hemlock, as president, runs the HOA with a policy of benign neglect. Our dues have been cut by 60%. The world kept spinning. The sun still rose. The aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood, it turned out, was not dependent on the shade of red on a mailbox flag. One morning, a few months after the Great Purge, a large moving truck pulled up to Brenda's old house. A young family got out, the parents chasing 2 small kids across the lawn. The lawn that no longer mattered. Helen was beside me on the porch, sipping her coffee. She had planted a whole garden of garish, multicolored petunias right on the edge of our property, a cheerful, silent monument to our victory. "You know," she said, In a weird way, we should thank her. She united this neighborhood more than any potluck ever could. She was right. Brenda, in her quest for absolute control, had accidentally created a community. She forged us in the fires of her own pettiness. As I watched the new family move in, I felt a sense of peace. The war was over. We had won. Not just the battle, but the war for the soul of the suburbs. We had proven that a neighborhood is a collection of people, not a set of rules. It's a living, breathing, slightly messy thing, not a sterile exhibit in a museum of conformity. My son, the quiet man in the hoodie, had reminded a power-tripping tyrant that no authority is absolute, and that sometimes the most unassuming people carry the biggest sticks. And I, the retired surveyor with a grudge and a set of old maps, had learned that sometimes you have to fight a war over a basketball hoop to win back your freedom. I took a sip of my coffee and looked out over my domain. My grass was a quarter-inch too long. My decorative flag was still unapproved. And on my property line, right where Brenda used to stand with her clipboard, there was a new addition to my garden, a small, concrete lawn gnome. He was painted to look like Alex, complete with a gray hoodie, and in his hand he held a tiny, tiny briefcase. He stood there, a silent guardian, a permanent reminder that even in the quietest of suburbs, you never know who you're dealing with. Tell me your best HOA story in the comments below, because I guarantee, whatever it is, it can't top this.